In the heart of a medieval village, nestled between the embrace of the dense forest and the whispering winds of the surrounding meadows, my life unfolds. I am known to the villagers as the herbalist, a title that carries with it both reverence and a hint of suspicion. My days are spent wandering the woods, gathering herbs and plants with healing properties known perhaps only to the birds that keep me company in my solitude. The villagers come to me with their ailments and woes, seeking the remedies that I craft with the knowledge passed down through generations of healers before me. They respect the cures I provide, yet their eyes often betray wariness, a reflection of the ancient fears and superstitions that still cling to their hearts, like the morning mist clings to the leaves of the forest. My hands, stained with the juices of roots and leaves, are a testament to my dedication to my craft and to the people of this village, despite their ambivalence towards what they do not fully understand. In this small, isolated world, my existence is a bridge between the old ways and the emerging understanding of the natural world. Yet, as I look into the faces of those I seek to help, I can't help but feel the weight of isolation that my unique position brings. They trust my remedies enough to seek them out, yet they hold me at arm's length, as if fearing that too close an association with me might taint them with the same suspicion under which I live. Thus, I find myself standing on the threshold of acceptance and mistrust, a guardian of ancient wisdom in a world that both needs and fears it. This is the paradox of my existence, the life of a village herbalist. The village, a tapestry of humble homes and cobblestone paths, lies cradled in the lap of nature. Its serenity is its charm, with the gentle hum of daily life weaving through the air like a lullaby. The rhythm of seasons dictates the pace of life here, the planting of seeds, the harvest, the preparation for winter's embrace. This isolation, a shield from the tumult of the wider world, has fostered a close-knit community, where every joy and sorrow is shared, where every face is familiar, and every story known. Yet, this seclusion, for all its peace, casts a long shadow. Beyond the fields and forests that border our village, the world remains a mystery, its troubles as distant as the stars. But isolation breeds not only tranquility but ignorance, a fertile ground for fear to take root and flourish. In this haven far removed from the turmoil of distant lands, we are untouched but not invincible. The stillness of our days belies the fragility of our existence, a reminder that peace is often a precursor to the storm. As I walk the paths worn by generations, the whispering winds seem to carry a foreboding chill, a hint of darkness on the horizon. It is a reminder that no community, no matter how serene, is an island entire of itself. The world has a way of reaching into the quietest corners, bringing with it the shadows we thought we had escaped. This awareness hangs over me like a silent promise, a reminder that even in our secluded paradise, we are not immune to the trials that test the spirit of humanity. The village, with its quilt of thatched roofs and winding cobblestone paths, unfurls itself beneath a vast expanse of the sky, a picture of untouched beauty and simplicity. Each morning, as the sun peeks over the horizon, it bathes the stone walls and wooden gates in a golden light, casting long shadows that dance with the day. The air, always fresh with the scent of earth and green, carries the sound of life from the open windows and doors. The clatter of cookware, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants opening their stalls for the day's trade. This place, where every road and alley tells a story, is a testament to the enduring rhythm of life that has pulsed through its veins for centuries. The fields that stretch beyond the village boundaries are a patchwork of green and gold, tended to by hands weathered by toil and time, but gentle in their love for the land. The forests that guard the village's edges are ancient sentinels, their canopies a sheltering embrace around the life nestled within. In this world of beauty and simplicity, I find my purpose and my solitude. My home, skirted by a small garden of herbs and healing plants, sits on the fringe of the village, a bridge between the wilds of the forest and the hearts of those I serve. My days are a blend of solitude and service, the solitude of my walks through the forest in search of herbs, the quiet hours spent in the company of mortar and pestle, and the service of tending to the ailments and worries of my neighbors. In this village, my existence is woven into the fabric of daily life, yet I stand apart, a solitary figure who walks the line between the known and the mysterious. My hands, stained with the green of healing plants, are a symbol of my role here. A keeper of ancient wisdom, a healer, and, to some, a mystery. I am as much a part of this village as the stone of the church or the water of the well, yet like the edge of the forest that touches the fields but belongs to neither, I inhabit a space that is both within and beyond the world I serve. It was a day like any other, with the sun casting its gentle warmth over the village and the fields beyond, when my quiet routine was broken by a hurried knock at my door. Standing on my threshold was a neighbor, a sturdy man known for his toil in the fields, his face etched with worry. In his arms, he cradled his young daughter, her cheeks flushed with fever and her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. The fear in his eyes spoke volumes before his voice could find the words. "She's burning up, and nothing I do seems to help," he said, the tremble in his voice betraying his stoic facade. I ushered them inside, laying the girl down on a makeshift bed near the hearth. My mind raced as I took in her symptoms. The fever, a cough that seemed to rack her small frame with an intensity that was alarming, and a lethargy that left her barely conscious. These were not the signs of any ailment I had encountered before in my years of tending to the village's ill. A sense of foreboding settled over me as I realized we were facing an unknown illness, a shadow that had crept into our midst unseen. Drawing upon my knowledge of herbs and the healing arts passed down through generations, I set to work with a sense of urgency. I brewed a potion of willow bark for the fever, its natural salicin, a remedy I had relied upon countless times. For her cough, a syrup made from the leaves of coltsfoot and mullein, herbs known for their soothing properties on the throat and lungs. And to bolster her waning strength, a tonic infused with echinacea and elderberry, hoping to stimulate her immune response to fight off this unseen adversary. With each remedy, I whispered a silent prayer, hoping that the wisdom of the earth held in these plants would be enough to turn the tide. As I administered the potions, the girl's father watched with a mixture of hope and desperation, his hands clasped tightly together, as if holding on to the last vestige of belief that his daughter would pull through. In the days that followed, I visited their home daily, monitoring her symptoms and adjusting my treatments as necessary. Slowly, the fever began to recede, and the strength returned to her body, a testament to the resilience of youth and the healing power of nature. Yet, as relief washed over us with her recovery, a gnawing worry took root in my heart. If this illness could strike so suddenly and with such ferocity, what was to prevent it from claiming others in our village? This encounter marked the beginning of a shadow that would soon stretch over our peaceful community, a harbinger of the trials we were yet to face. It was a reminder of the fragile balance between health and sickness, and the constant battle waged by those of us who sought to tip the scales towards healing. As days turned into weeks, the initial relief of my young patient's recovery faded into a growing sense of dread. The illness, a specter that had briefly shown its face, did not retreat into the shadows as I had hoped. Instead, it began to spread through the village with a silent, insidious persistence. One by one, more villagers came to my door, their symptoms mirroring those of the first. Fevers that refused to break, coughs that left even the strongest among us gasping for breath, and a fatigue so profound it anchored them to their beds. With each new case, my concern deepened into a palpable fear. This was no ordinary ailment we were facing, but something far more formidable. An unseen enemy that slipped through our defenses, invisible and indiscriminate in its reach. The remedies I had relied upon, the knowledge that had been passed down to me, seemed suddenly inadequate against the magnitude of this threat. I found myself racing against time, poring over my books and scrolls, consulting the accumulated wisdom of healers and herbalists who had come before me. I experimented with different combinations of herbs, searching for any blend that might halt the spread of the disease. I sent messages to neighboring villages, inquiring if they had encountered similar symptoms and what treatments, if any, had proven effective. Despite my efforts, the illness continued to claim more of my neighbors with each passing day. The village, once filled with the sounds of life, began to quiet, a hush born of fear and uncertainty. Fields lay untended, and gatherings became rare, the community isolating in an attempt to stem the spread of the disease. As I watched the village succumb to this invisible foe, my role as its healer weighed heavily upon me. Doubt crept into my heart, whispering questions I could not answer. Had I missed some crucial piece of knowledge, some remedy that could have turned the tide? Was there more I could have done, or was I fighting a battle that was lost from the beginning? The fear that gripped our community threatened to unravel the bonds that held us together, leaving us isolated not just from the world beyond our borders, but from each other. In the quiet moments, when the weight of my thoughts became too much to bear, I found myself looking to the forest that bordered our village, its depths holding both the promise of healing and the mystery of the unknown. It stood as a reminder that, despite our advancements, we were still at the mercy of forces beyond our understanding, a humbling thought that both challenged and drove me to continue my fight against this unseen enemy. As the illness wove its dark tapestry through the fabric of our village, a change began to take root among my neighbors. Fear, a subtle and insidious creature, began to morph the familiar faces of friends and acquaintances into masks of suspicion and doubt. It wasn't just a disease that was spreading through our streets and homes, it was fear itself, infecting minds, turning the afflicted and healthy alike against one another and, increasingly, against me. In the beginning, their trust in me had been a given, as much a part of the village's life as the changing seasons. They came to me with their fevers, their wounds, their worries, and I met them with remedies and reassurances. But as the plague continued its relentless march, leaving grief and despair in its wake, that trust began to erode. I could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices, a hesitance, a withdrawal. Where once there had been gratitude, now there were questions, doubts whispered behind closed doors, which eventually made their way back to me. They say she walks the forest at night, consorting with forces we dare not speak of, one voice whispered at the market, not knowing I was within earshot. Her potions bring more sickness than health, accused another, a statement that stung with its baselessness and cruelty. The most painful murmurs, however, were those that questioned not just my skills but my very character. Perhaps it is no coincidence that the disease spreads fastest where the herbalist's shadow falls, a villager mused, casting a furtive glance my way, as if the mere act of speaking to me might bring the illness to his door. These murmurs of suspicion grew like weeds, choking the trust that had once flourished between us. I found myself becoming a specter in my own village, an otherworldly figure blamed for the very catastrophe I was striving to avert. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The hands that had toiled to bring healing were now feared, as if I, too, were a carrier of the plague. Each visit to a sick villager's home became a trial, each offer of help met with a wariness that bordered on hostility. I began to move through the village like a ghost, my presence tolerated but no longer welcomed. The realization that I was becoming isolated from the community I cherished, at a time when we needed unity more than ever, was a source of deep sorrow and frustration. In this atmosphere of growing distrust, I clung to the hope that my actions would speak louder than the fearful whispers. Yet, as the days passed and the illness claimed more lives, I could not help but wonder if the chasm growing between us could ever be bridged again. The fight against the disease was hard enough. Battling the villagers' fear and suspicion felt like waging war on a second, equally formidable front. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of our village life reached its boiling point on a day that began like any other, under the heavy pall of fear and illness that had become all too familiar. I was in the square, distributing herbs and concoctions to those still willing to accept my aid, when the murmurs of the crowd coalesced into a single, accusing voice. It was Thomas, the blacksmith, a man whose strength was renowned in the village, and whose family had not been spared by the illness. Enough. His voice boomed across the square, cutting through the low conversations and drawing all eyes to him and then to me. We've been fools, trusting in her remedies, hoping for a cure that never comes. Can't you see? The sickness only spreads further, claiming our loved ones while she roams free, untouched by the affliction that befalls us. I felt the weight of every gaze, heavy with grief and accusation, as the space around us seemed to shrink. Are we to believe this is mere coincidence? Thomas continued, his eyes blazing with anger and desperation. Or is it more likely that she has brought this curse upon us, consorting with dark forces, practicing witchcraft? His words, like sparks to tinder, ignited the fear and suspicion that had been festering in the hearts of my neighbors. Murmurs of agreement and nods of head swept through the crowd, a collective turning that chilled me to the bone. The trust and camaraderie that had once defined our community were now replaced by a witch hunt, with me as its quarry. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the tremor of disbelief and fear that threatened to undermine my resolve. You know me, I said, addressing not just Thomas but the entire assembly. I have lived among you, shared in your joys and sorrows, and dedicated my life to healing, not harming. This illness is a natural scourge, one that I have fought tirelessly to overcome with every bit of knowledge and skill I possess. But my words, it seemed, fell on deaf ears. The fear had taken too deep a root, and reason found no purchase among those who saw in me not a healer, but the embodiment of their darkest fears. Which? The cry went up from a voice in the crowd, quickly taken up by others, a chorus of accusation that drowned out my pleas for reason and understanding. The confrontation in the square marked a turning point, not just for me but for the entire village. Where once there had been respect and gratitude, there was now only fear and suspicion. I realized in that moment that the battle I was fighting was no longer just against the illness, but against the very people I had sworn to protect. The path before me was a lonely one, strewn with the peril of suspicion and the threat of violence, a reflection of how deeply fear can divide even the closest of communities. In the midst of the uproar, with accusations of witchcraft swirling around me like a malevolent storm, I found a sliver of courage to stand my ground. The square, once a place of communal gathering and shared purpose, had transformed into a tribunal with me cast as the villain in a narrative I had no hand in writing. Please, listen to me, I implored, my voice striving to reach the hearts and minds of those who had turned against me. I am no witch, nor have I ever consorted with dark forces, I continued, the urgency in my voice underscored by the gravity of the situation. This illness that has befallen us is a natural phenomenon, one that has afflicted humanity throughout history. It is not a curse but a disease, spread from person to person, not by malevolence, but by the mere accident of contact. I spoke of the balance of nature, how disease and health coexist in an eternal dance, guided by the unseen hand of the natural world. I explained the principles of contagion, how certain conditions can cause an illness to spread more rapidly, and the importance of cleanliness, quarantine, and herbal remedies in combating the outbreak. Yet, as I offered my defense, a plea for reason and understanding in the face of fear and superstition, I could see the barrier of mistrust growing ever stronger. Their faces, once familiar and friendly, now seemed to belong to strangers, their eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, anger, and something akin to betrayal. It was as if my words, meant to bridge the chasm that had opened between us, only served to widen it further. My attempts to explain the natural origins of the disease, to demystify the plague with logic and knowledge, seemed to fall on deaf ears. The more I spoke of nature and science, the more I was met with skepticism and hostility. It was a bitter realization, the understanding that my lifelong dedication to healing and the wisdom I had accumulated were now the very things that alienated me from my community. In their eyes, I was no longer the healer who had tended to their wounds and soothed their ailments. I was an outsider, an other, someone to be feared and shunned. The irony was a cruel twist of fate. In seeking to combat the darkness of ignorance and fear, I had inadvertently cast myself into the shadows. As I stood there, facing the growing hostility of those I had once considered my kin, I felt a profound sense of isolation. It was not just the physical threat of violence that loomed over me, but the emotional toll of being cast out, of being misunderstood and maligned by those I had sworn to protect. In trying to reason with my accusers, I had hoped to dispel the fear that clouded their judgment. Instead, I found myself increasingly isolated, a lone voice of reason in a chorus of suspicion and dread. In the days following the confrontation in the square, the atmosphere in the village grew increasingly charged with tension and paranoia. Whispers of witchcraft and dark dealings spread like wildfire, fueled by fear and the relentless march of the illness through our streets. It became clear that my presence, once a beacon of healing and hope, now served only to stoke the flames of suspicion and unrest. It was a heart-wrenching decision, but the realization dawned on me that to stay visible, to continue as I had, would only endanger myself and potentially exacerbate the situation. The last vestiges of trust had eroded, leaving me with no choice but to seek refuge in the very shadows that the village had cast me into. I decided to hide, to retreat into the margins of the world I loved, not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate desire to continue my work, to find some way to combat the illness from the periphery. My retreat was to the forest, a place of solace and source of my knowledge, now my sanctuary in a time of peril. Here, among the whispering trees and healing herbs, I found the semblance of peace, a respite from the storm of suspicion that raged back in the village. But even as I sought safety and solitude, my heart remained with those who were suffering. I could not, in good conscience, abandon them to the mercy of an illness that I knew in my bones could be combated, if not cured. Thus, I continued my work in secret, venturing out under the cover of darkness to deliver remedies to the doorsteps of the sick. I left potions and salves with instructions, whispered words of comfort and guidance through cracks in doors and windows, reaching out to those in need from the shadows. It was a precarious existence, fraught with risk, but it was the only way I could see to fulfill my duty as a healer, without further endangering myself or inflaming the village's paranoia. This dual life, hiding by day and working by night, became my new reality. Each foray into the village was a calculated risk, a delicate dance with danger, as I navigated the narrow paths and alleyways that had once welcomed me with open arms. The irony of my situation was not lost on me. Once sought after for my skills, I was now forced to offer them in secret, a ghostly benefactor moving unseen among those who had once been my neighbors, my friends. In the solitude of my forest refuge, I wrestled with a myriad of emotions: fear, frustration, sorrow, but above all, a stubborn determination to continue my fight against the illness. The knowledge that my efforts, however clandestine, were making a difference, that in some small way I was alleviating the suffering of my fellow villagers, was a beacon of hope in the darkness. It was a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the unbreakable will to aid those in need, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. During this dark period of secrecy and solitude, the weight of loneliness and fear became my constant companions. Hidden away in the depths of the forest, my only solace lay in the whispering leaves and the quiet company of the wildlife that roamed as freely as I once did. The irony of my situation was a bitter pill to swallow. Here I was, a healer ostracized by the very community I sought to protect, forced to work in the shadows to avoid the wrath of those blinded by fear. Each night, as I ventured into the village under the cloak of darkness, my heart ached with the pain of separation and the sting of rejection. The homes that had once welcomed me with open doors now stood closed and silent, their inhabitants wary of the night and the specters they believed lurked within it. My attempts to help, to bring relief and healing, were done in utter solitude, with no one to share in the small victories or to console me in the face of relentless adversity. The fear that gripped me was not just for my own safety, though the threat of discovery loomed large with every step I took. It was also a fear for those I left behind each dawn, for the village that had become a battleground of superstition and ignorance. I worried that my efforts might not be enough, that the disease would continue its merciless advance, despite my best attempts to stem its tide. But perhaps the most profound sorrow came from the realization that the community I had dedicated my life to serving had turned its back on me. The bonds of trust and friendship, once thought unbreakable, had frayed and snapped under the strain of fear and uncertainty. I mourned the loss of those connections deeply, feeling as though I had been cast adrift, untethered from the very fabric of village life. This period of isolation was one of introspection and, admittedly, moments of despair. There were times when the solitude became overwhelming, when the silence of the forest seemed to echo with the voices of those I could no longer reach. Yet, it was in this solitude that I also found a reservoir of strength I hadn't known I possessed. The determination to continue, to fight against both the disease and the tide of suspicion that had swept through the village, became a flame that burned all the brighter in the darkness of my circumstances. Working in secret, I clung to the hope that my efforts would someday be recognized, that the veil of fear and misunderstanding would be lifted, and the community would see that my intentions had always been to heal and protect. Until that day, I resolved to carry on, bearing the loneliness and the fear as the price of my commitment to the well-being of the village, a commitment that endured even in the face of ostracization and adversity. In the solitude of my forest hideaway, amidst the endless cycle of fear and secrecy, a glimmer of hope emerged from the depths of despair. It was during a moonlit night, under the canopy of ancient trees that whispered secrets of the ages, that I stumbled upon a potential remedy. My hands, guided by intuition and the wisdom passed down through generations, uncovered a combination of herbs known for their potent antiviral properties: mugwort, yarrow, and elderberry, a trio that seemed to hum with a promise of healing. The discovery was a beacon in the darkness, a tangible sign that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide could be turned. But with the hope came a realization of the risk involved. To test this remedy, to prove its efficacy, I would have to step out of the shadows and into the light of potential peril. The decision weighed heavily on me, for it was not just my own safety at stake, but also that of the family who would place their trust in my hands. After much deliberation, shrouded in the secrecy of night, I approached the home of the Thompsons, a family struck hard by the illness. Their youngest lay feverish and weak, a sight that spurred my resolve. With a heart heavy with the burden of what I was about to undertake, I knocked softly on their door, a clandestine visitor in the night. The door creaked open, and the face that greeted me was a tapestry of fear, hope, and desperation. I was ushered inside with a mixture of trepidation and relief. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering flame of a single candle, casting long shadows that danced upon the walls. In the silence, I explained my discovery, the potential remedy clutched in my hands, and the risk it entailed not just for them, but for me as well. To my surprise and eternal gratitude, they agreed. The weight of their decision, the trust they placed in me despite the whispers and warnings, was a testament to their desperation, but also to the enduring flicker of faith in human kindness and the pursuit of healing. I administered the remedy with a whispered prayer, a plea to the forces of nature and the wisdom of the ancients to guide my hand. The risk was immense. Being discovered meant not just the end of my freedom, but potentially the end of my life. Yet, in that moment, all fears were secondary to the urgent need to act, to apply the knowledge and intuition that had led me to this potential turning point. The night passed in a vigil of whispered hopes and anxious waiting, the hours stretching long and thin like the shadows that flickered across the room. As dawn broke, painting the sky with the first light of morning, there was a change, a subtle shift in the air, a sense of something that had loosened its grip ever so slightly. The days that followed were a testament to the power of hope, as the Thompsons' child began to show signs of improvement. It was a victory, small and fragile, but a victory nonetheless. The risk I had taken, sneaking out to treat a family in dire need, had paid off, offering a ray of hope in the darkest of times. This breakthrough, however, was not without its consequences. The knowledge of my nighttime visit did not remain a secret for long, and with it, the danger to my safety grew. Yet, even as the specter of suspicion loomed ever larger, the success of the remedy offered a beacon of hope, a possible path forward in the battle against the unseen enemy that had brought our village to its knees. The incident with the Thompson's child marked a pivotal moment in my solitary battle against the encroaching darkness. The small victory, achieved under the veil of night and shrouded in secrecy, ignited a spark of hope within me, a flickering flame in the overwhelming gloom. The child's recovery, though but a single instance in the face of widespread despair, was a beacon that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide could be turned. Not only against the relentless march of the disease, but also against the pervasive cloud of fear that had settled over the village. Armed with this fragile hope, I continued my work with renewed vigor. Each successful treatment, each life reclaimed from the brink, was a victory not just against the illness, but against the prevailing atmosphere of dread. With every potion brewed, every secret visit to a sickbed, I dared to dream of a day when the village would emerge from the shadow of fear, united once more in the face of adversity. Yet, these aspirations were tempered by the reality of the situation. The risk of discovery loomed ever larger with each passing day, and with it, the threat of retribution. The balance between hope and fear was a delicate one, each step forward, shadowed by the risk of being undone by suspicion and superstition. In this tumultuous time, the small victories became my beacon, guiding me through the darkness. They were a reminder that change was possible, that healing was within reach, if only we could stand together against the real enemy. It was a hope that I clung to, a promise to myself that I would not cease in my efforts until the village was free from the grip of the disease and the paralyzing fear that accompanied it. This hope, fragile yet unyielding, was what sustained me, driving me forward in the belief that, in the end, light would prevail over darkness. The fragile veil of secrecy under which I had operated, dispensing hope and healing under the cover of night, was shattered in an instant, a moment that marked the deepest betrayal I had ever known. The shock of being turned in by someone I thought I could trust was a blow more crippling than any accusation of witchcraft or fear-driven hostility from the village at large. It was a betrayal that cut to the very core of my being, severing ties I had believed unbreakable, and leaving me exposed and vulnerable in ways I had never anticipated. The day began like any other in those tumultuous times, under the shadow of suspicion, but driven by a purpose that transcended personal risk. My clandestine efforts to treat the sick and contain the spread of the disease had become my life's sole focus, each successful recovery, a silent victory against the twin scourges of illness and fear. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that merged with the coming night, my world was upended. I was preparing for another night of furtive visits, the quiet of my secluded refuge, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the soft clink of glass vials, when they came. The door, a barrier that had offered a semblance of safety, was no match for their determined force. The faces that burst into my sanctuary were familiar, yet transformed by suspicion and anger into masks of strangers. Among them, leading the charge with a torch in hand, was the very person I had considered a friend, a confidant in a village that had grown increasingly hostile. The sense of betrayal was immediate, a piercing stab of disbelief and sorrow. How could someone I trusted, someone who had seen firsthand the healing I brought to our community, turn against me? The question spiraled in my mind, a tumultuous storm that offered no shelter, no reprieve. Their accusations, though expected from the mouths of others, were a poison when spoken by a friend. "You've been consorting with the darkness, endangering us all," my once friend declared, the conviction in their voice a stark contrast to the memories of shared confidences and mutual respect. The others echoed this sentiment, a chorus of condemnation that drowned out my protests, my explanations, my pleas for understanding. The realization that my secret efforts, my nightly risks to aid those in need, had been exposed by someone I believed stood by me was a betrayal that reshaped my world. Trust, once given freely, now seemed a luxury I could ill afford. The fabric of my existence in this village, woven through with threads of healing and hope, had been unraveled with a single act of treachery. As I was led away, the faces of the villagers blending into a blur of anger and fear, the weight of the betrayal bore down on me. It was not just the loss of freedom that pained me, but the loss of faith in those I had called my neighbors, my friends. The journey from my home to the heart of the village, under the watchful eyes of those I had served, was a walk through the ashes of burned bridges, a path marked by the stark realization that the world I knew had irrevocably changed. The shock and pain of that betrayal, of being turned in by someone I thought I could trust, would remain a haunting specter, a reminder of the cost of fear and the fragility of trust in the face of darkness. The moment of my capture was surreal, a stark departure from the life of secrecy and silent healing I had led since the outbreak began. Surrounded by villagers, their faces twisted into expressions of fear and anger, I was forcibly removed from my haven of solitude and thrust into the glaring light of accusation. The hands that seized me were not those of strangers, but of people I had known for years, people I had helped and lived alongside. Yet, in their grip, I felt only the cold touch of betrayal and the heat of their hysteria. The realization of how deeply the hysteria had taken root within the village was a harrowing revelation. As I was led through the streets, the very paths I had walked in quieter, happier times, I saw the faces of my neighbors. Some averted their eyes, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze, while others looked on with a mix of fear, anger, and something akin to satisfaction. The air was thick with tension, a tangible manifestation of the paranoia that had engulfed the community. This hysteria had transformed the village, once a place of mutual support and understanding, into a landscape of suspicion and fear. The illness, with its shadow of death and suffering, had sown the seeds of this madness, but it was the villagers' own fears that had watered them, allowing them to grow unchecked. The mob that dragged me forward was not just a group of individuals, but a symbol of this collective madness, a community consumed by the terror of the unknown. The shouts and cries that filled the air as I was paraded through the village were a cacophony of chaos, each voice adding to the hysteria that had taken hold. Accusations of witchcraft, of cursing the village with this plague, were hurled at me like stones, each word a blow to the heart. The irony that I, who had worked tirelessly to find a cure, to ease the suffering brought by this disease, should be blamed for its ravages was a bitter pill to swallow. My capture, under the eyes of those I had once considered my community, was a stark demonstration of the power of fear. It had the ability to warp perception, to turn neighbor against neighbor, healer against the healed. The realization that this fear and anger had driven the villagers to capture one of their own, to see me not as a source of healing but as a harbinger of their misfortunes, was a profound shock. It underscored the depth of the hysteria that had taken root, a madness so deep that it blinded them to reason and compassion. As I stood bound and accused, the center of a storm of fear and hysteria, the fabric of the village seemed irrevocably altered. The trust and bonds that had once united us were now shattered, replaced by a chasm of suspicion and fear. The realization that this hysteria had not only claimed my freedom, but it also eroded the very heart of our community, was a somber reflection on the destructive power of fear, a power that could transform a village into a mob and a healer into a witch. My trial, if it could even be dignified with such a term, was a farce from its inception, a macabre spectacle driven more by fear and hysteria than any pursuit of truth. As I stood before the assembled villagers, my heart sank, not just from fear for my own fate, but for the realization of how deeply the roots of paranoia had entwined themselves around the hearts of those I had lived among and served. The makeshift courtroom, usually a place of communal gatherings and celebrations, had been transformed into an arena of judgment, its walls echoing with the murmurings of a crowd gripped by fear. At the center of this tempest stood I, the accused, facing charges of witchcraft, an allegation as baseless as it was absurd. Yet, in the eyes of my accusers, my guilt was a foregone conclusion, my trial nothing more than a formality to legitimize their fear-fueled verdict. The evidence presented against me was laughable in its absurdity, yet tragic in its consequences. A concoction of hearsay, misunderstanding of my craft, and outright fabrications painted me not as the healer I was, but as a malevolent witch, using my knowledge of herbs and healing to bring ruin upon the village. Each accusation was more ludicrous than the last, yet met with nods of agreement and murmurs of approval from the crowd, a testament to the madness that had seized them. As I listened to the charges, a sense of surreal disbelief washed over me. Was this truly happening? Was I, who had devoted my life to the well-being of this community, to be condemned on such spurious grounds? The irony was a bitter draught, the knowledge that my efforts to combat the disease, to save lives, had been twisted into the very rope that now threatened to hang me. My defense, a plea for reason and sanity, fell on deaf ears. I spoke of the natural origins of the disease, of the remedies I had crafted not through dark arts, but through knowledge passed down through generations of healers. I implored them to see the truth, to recognize the real enemy was not among them, but invisible, a virus that cared not for the superstitions and fears of humankind. But the court was not a place for truth that day, it was a theater of fear, where logic and reason played no part. The verdict, when it came, was as inevitable as the setting sun. Guilty of witchcraft, they declared, their voices a unified chorus of fear-driven certainty. As the sentence was pronounced, a part of me marveled at the absurdity of it all, the tragic comedy that had led to this moment. Standing alone against the accusations, I felt the weight of isolation more acutely than ever before. The village, my home, had turned its back on me, choosing instead the comfort of a scapegoat to the discomfort of facing their fears. The trial, a farce driven by fear rather than truth, was a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of human nature. In that moment, as I faced the judgment of those I had once called my own, I understood the true nature of the trial. It was not about guilt or innocence, but about the power of fear to destroy the bonds of community and reason. Alone, I stood condemned, not for any crime, but for the crime of being misunderstood in a time of crisis. Within the cacophony of fear and anger that characterized my trial, there emerged a few brave souls who dared to raise their voices in my defense. These voices of support, though few and far between, were like rays of light piercing the dark shroud of hysteria that had enveloped the village. Yet, as quickly as they rose, they were drowned out by the overwhelming cries for my punishment, a tidal wave of fear that silenced reason and compassion. One by one, these supporters stood to recount tales of healing and aid I had provided, of lives saved and suffering eased by my hand. They spoke of my dedication to the village, of the countless days and nights spent in the service of those in need. Their words painted a picture of a healer, not a witch, of a woman driven by compassion, not malice. But their testimonies were but whispers against the storm, quickly swept away by the fervor of the crowd, their logic lost in the din of accusations, and cries for justice, a justice that had no foundation in truth. As I stood there, listening to the few voices of support being eclipsed by the demand for my condemnation, a profound sense of despair began to take root within me. It was a battle on two fronts. Against the external forces of fear and ignorance that sought to crush me, and against the internal surge of hopelessness that threatened to engulf my spirit. This internal struggle was a silent one, unseen by the eyes that watched me, with a mixture of fear, anger, and, in some cases, sorrow. The knowledge that there were those who still believed in my innocence, who recognized the value of the work I had done, was a small comfort, but it battled against the overwhelming sense of betrayal and abandonment. The realization that my fate was likely sealed, regardless of the truth, was a heavy chain around my heart, pulling me into the depths of despair. Yet, even as the cries for my punishment grew louder, and the voices of support were silenced one by one, a stubborn spark of defiance flickered within me. It was a refusal to let despair have the final word, a determination to maintain my dignity in the face of unjust condemnation. This internal struggle, this fight to keep despair at bay, became as much a part of my trial as the accusations hurled against me. The trial, with its farcical proceedings and predetermined outcome, was a reflection of the hysteria that had gripped the village. But my internal battle, the effort to hold on to hope and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, was a testament to the human spirit's resilience. Even as the external voices clamored for my downfall, the internal ones fought to remind me of who I was. Not a witch, but a healer, not a villain, but a victim of fear and misunderstanding. This struggle against despair was perhaps the hardest fight of all, a silent war waged in the depths of my soul. In the darkest hour, when the weight of despair threatened to crush me completely, a flicker of hope emerged from an unexpected quarter. A handful of sympathetic villagers, those brave souls who had dared to speak in my defense during the trial, and others who had remained silent, fearful yet disbelieving of the charges against me, banded together in a bold plan to secure my escape. Their actions were a testament to the resilience of human compassion, a beacon of light in the pervasive darkness of fear and hysteria that had consumed the village. Under the cover of night, shrouded in secrecy and silence, these courageous individuals executed their plan with a precision that belied their desperation. They came for me, not as captors, but as liberators, their faces masked not for anonymity, but to protect them from the retribution that would surely follow, should our plan be discovered. The realization that there were still those who believed in my innocence, who were willing to risk their own safety for mine, imbued me with a strength I had thought lost. The escape was a daring endeavor, fraught with risk at every turn. We moved through the village like shadows, avoiding the watchful eyes of those who had called for my blood, our every step a defiance of the unjust fate that had been decreed for me. The solidarity of my rescuers was a palpable force, a silent vow that we were bound by a cause greater than ourselves, the pursuit of truth and the salvation of our community from the true enemy, the disease that ravaged unchecked. Once beyond the confines of the village, we paused, the urgency of our flight momentarily giving way to the gravity of what we had undertaken. It was then, in the hushed whispers of our makeshift council, that I shared the fruits of my labor, a cure, or at least a potent remedy, that had shown promise in the few I had managed to treat in secret. The decision to distribute this cure, to make one last-ditch effort to stem the tide of the disease, was unanimous. It was a plan born of desperation, certainly, but also of hope, the hope that we could yet turn the tide, not only against the disease, but against the fear that had torn our village asunder. The distribution of the cure was a mission carried out under the cloak of darkness, a silent rebellion against the ignorance and superstition that had led to my condemnation. We moved from house to house, leaving behind the remedy with instructions for its use, a silent plea for sanity to prevail. Each drop of the cure dispensed was a seed of hope, sown in the fertile ground of desperation, watered with the sweat of our nocturnal toil. This last-ditch effort to distribute the cure, undertaken with the help of those few sympathetic villagers, was my final act of defiance against the madness that had claimed my home. It was a daring escape not just from the physical confines of my imprisonment, but from the despair that had threatened to consume me. Whether it would be enough to turn the tide, to heal both the bodies and the fractured spirit of the village, remained to be seen. But in that moment, as we parted ways, each to our own fate, I knew that we had rekindled a spark of hope in the heart of darkness, a defiance that would endure regardless of the outcome. In the days that followed my daring escape and the clandestine distribution of the cure, the fruits of our labors began to manifest in the most bittersweet of ways. Lives that had been teetering on the edge of despair showed signs of renewal, and whispers of my innocence, powered by the undeniable evidence of recovery among those we had treated, began to spread like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. Yet, this glimmer of hope was overshadowed by the heavy hand of fate, as my freedom was short-lived, and I was recaptured by those who could not, or would not, see beyond their fear. As I was led back into the village, now not as a suspected witch, but as a proven healer whose only crime was to challenge the tide of ignorance with knowledge and compassion, the irony of my situation was not lost on me. The very cure that had provided undeniable proof of my intentions also served as the beacon that led my captors to me, a cruel twist that underscored the futility of my efforts against the overwhelming force of collective hysteria. Reflecting on the events that had unfolded, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of disillusionment. The lives saved by the cure, while a testament to the efficacy of my remedies and the potential for healing even in the face of such adversity, seemed like mere drops in an ocean of fear and suspicion. The village, though spared from complete decimation by the plague, remained imprisoned by its own paranoia, a disease of the mind far more difficult to cure than any physical ailment. The realization that my efforts, though successful in saving some, were ultimately futile in changing the hearts and minds of the majority, weighed heavily on me. It was a stark reminder of the power of fear, how it can warp perception and logic, turning neighbor against neighbor, and healer into scapegoat. The cure I had worked so tirelessly to develop and distribute, though it had brought tangible hope and healing to some, had not been enough to penetrate the thick fog of fear that had settled over the village. As I faced the consequences of my recapture, the bittersweet nature of my partial success became a source of both pride and sorrow. Pride, for the lives I had managed to touch and save with my knowledge and determination, and sorrow, for the realization that the battle against ignorance and fear was far from over, perhaps even unwinnable in the face of such overwhelming odds. In those moments of reflection, the futility of my efforts loomed large, a shadow cast by the enduring power of fear over reason. Yet, even in the face of this harsh reality, a stubborn spark of hope refused to be extinguished, a silent defiance against the notion that my efforts had been in vain. For in the eyes of those saved, in the whispered thanks and the silent nods of recognition, there lay the undeniable proof that change, though slow and fraught with challenge, was indeed possible. It was a small comfort, a fragile beacon in the storm, but it was enough to keep the flame of hope alive, even in the darkest of times. Confined within the cold, unforgiving walls of my cell, the world outside seemed to recede into a distant memory, a life once lived now viewed through the murky lens of my current reality. The news that reached me was grim, a litany of sorrow that spoke of a village not on the mend, but in a continuing, perhaps terminal, decline. The plague, relentless and unforgiving, continued its ravage through the community, its appetite for destruction undiminished by the few lives my efforts had managed to save. Each new report was a dagger to the heart, a cruel reminder of the potential for healing that was now beyond my reach, locked away as I was, powerless and isolated. The deaths mounted, each one a name, a face, a life with which I had once been familiar. These were not mere statistics, but stories cut short, families torn apart, and the fabric of our village irreparably frayed. The magnitude of loss was overwhelming, a tide of grief that threatened to drown the remnants of our once vibrant community in despair. From my cell, the reality of the village's suffering was both a torment and a call to action, a painful reminder of the urgency of the situation, and the cruel irony of my inability to intervene. The knowledge that I possessed, which could stem this tide of death, lay dormant, trapped behind the bars of superstition and fear, just as I was trapped behind the physical bars of my cell. The continuing decline of the village, in the face of the plague's unchecked progress, was a testament to the devastating impact of fear and ignorance. It underscored the tragic consequences of the community's refusal to embrace the knowledge and understanding that could have altered our collective fate. The plague ravaged without prejudice, and in its wake, the village was left a shadow of its former self, its future uncertain, its survival hanging in the balance. Hearing of this decline from the confines of my cell, I was consumed by a profound sense of helplessness and frustration. The knowledge that I could make a difference, that the key to the village's salvation lay in the very practices for which I was condemned, was a bitter pill to swallow. The irony of my situation was a constant companion, a reminder of the tragic cost of ignorance and the devastating price of fear. As the day of my execution dawned, a heavy silence seemed to envelop the village, a solemn acknowledgement of the impending tragedy that was to unfold. Bound and led to the place where my life was to end, I couldn't help but reflect on the catastrophic sequence of events that had led to this moment, the culmination of fear, ignorance, and tragedy that had decimated the community I once called home. Standing before those who had once been my neighbors, my friends, I saw in their faces a complex tapestry of emotions: fear, sorrow, and perhaps, in some, a flicker of doubt. Did they truly believe in the justice of what was about to transpire, or was it merely the final act of a collective hysteria that had taken hold of their better judgment? My final thoughts, as I faced the end, were not of anger or bitterness, but of profound sadness for the village and its people. The loss of life, both from the plague and the ensuing witch hunts, was a tragedy of immeasurable proportions, a wound that would mark the soul of the village for generations to come. Families had been torn apart, wisdom and knowledge lost, and the fabric of the community irreparably damaged. The harsh lesson learned too late was that fear, once allowed to take root, can destroy from within more effectively than any external threat. The real enemy was not the disease, nor was it those who sought to heal, but the unchecked paranoia and superstition that had led to such devastating consequences. The tragedy that befell the village was not just the result of the plague, but the manifestation of a deeper malice, a collective abandonment of reason and compassion in the face of fear. As I faced my final moments, my hope was that my death might serve as a catalyst for reflection, a sobering reminder of the cost of ignorance and the value of understanding. Perhaps, in time, the story of what had happened here would serve as a cautionary tale, a plea for tolerance and the pursuit of knowledge over the darkness of superstition and fear. Yet, even as I accepted my fate, a part of me mourned not just for what had been lost, but for what might have been. The village, with all its potential for growth and renewal, had been irrevocably changed, a shadow of its former self. The tragedy that had unfolded was a testament to the fragility of community and the perilous path of fear-driven judgment. In my final thoughts, I clung to a sliver of hope that from the ashes of this tragedy, a new understanding might emerge, a recognition of the importance of compassion, knowledge, and the courage to face the unknown not with fear, but with an open heart and mind. My last wish, whispered to the wind as I faced the end, was for healing, not just from the physical scars of the plague, but from the deeper wounds of division and mistrust. It was a wish for the future, a plea for the next generation to embrace a path of understanding and unity, to ensure that the tragedy that befell the village would never be repeated. Years had passed since the dark days that saw the village nearly consumed by plague and fear. Among the few who remained, the memory of those times lingered like a shadow, a haunting reminder of what had been lost and the price paid for lessons learned too harshly. Among these survivors was an elder, one of the rare souls who had witnessed the entirety of the tragedy, from its fearful beginning to its bitter end. Seated by the hearth of the now quiet and much diminished village, the elder recounted the story with a mix of sorrow and reverence, the tale of the herbalist whose wisdom and compassion had once offered a beacon of hope amidst the despair. She was one among us, yet stood apart, blessed with knowledge of the natural world and the healing arts, the elder began, their voice a soft murmur that drew the listeners closer, eager yet apprehensive to hear the tale anew. The elder spoke of how, when the illness first swept through the village, it was the herbalist who tended to the sick, who sought tirelessly for a cure, even as fear and suspicion began to cloud the judgment of those around her. She fought for us, for every life, even as whispers of witchcraft and darker arts began to spread, a poison no less deadly than the plague itself, the elder continued, the weight of regret palpable in their tone. As the story unfolded, the elder recounted the growing hysteria, the way fear had twisted the villagers' hearts, leading to accusations that culminated in the herbalist's unjust execution. We were blinded by fear, led astray by our own darkest impulses, the elder admitted, a note of grief in their voice. In our panic, we turned on the one who sought to save us, labeling her a witch, attributing to malice what was in truth an act of the deepest bravery and compassion. The elder paused, their gaze lost in the flickering flames, as if seeking forgiveness from the shadows. It was only after her death, when the plague continued its ravage unchecked by her healing hand, that we realized the grave mistake we had made. Too late did we understand the value of her wisdom, the gift of her healing. Too late did we recognize the true nature of the enemy, not the illness, nor the herbalist, but our own unfounded fears. The tale concluded with a reflection on the aftermath, the slow and painful process of rebuilding not just the village, but the trust and communal bonds that had been shattered. Her legacy lives on, not just in the sorrowful memory of our loss, but in the hard-earned wisdom that came from our mistake. We learned, at too great a cost, the importance of questioning our fears, of valuing knowledge and understanding over superstition and panic. The listeners, moved by the recounting, were left to ponder the lessons of the past, the elder's story serving as a solemn reminder of the cost of ignorance and fear, and the enduring value of compassion and wisdom. In the heart of the village, the memory of the herbalist was no longer one of accusation and betrayal, but a testament to the courage to heal, to love, and to stand firm in the face of darkness. Her story, passed down through the generations, became a beacon of hope, a warning never to repeat the mistakes of the past, and a tribute to the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the quiet solitude of the elder's recollections, a profound reflection emerged, weaving through the narrative like a delicate thread, highlighting the intricate tapestry of human emotion, and the indelible marks left by fear, misunderstanding, and the tragic consequences of a community engulfed by panic. This reflection, steeped in the wisdom of hindsight, sought to unravel the complex legacy of those dark times, focusing on the herbalist's fate, an emblem of sacrifice, enlightenment, and the tragic cost of ignorance. Fear, the elder began, their voice a somber echo of the past, has a power unlike any other, to transform the familiar into the unknown, to turn neighbor against neighbor, and to make monsters out of shadows. It was fear, unchecked and fanned into flames by uncertainty, that led our village down the path to tragedy. In our desperation to find a scapegoat for the plague, we turned on one of our own, a healer who stood against the tide of despair with nothing but her knowledge and her courage. In our frenzy, we did not just kill a supposed witch, we extinguished a flame of hope, a chance for understanding and healing. The tragedy of her fate lies not only in the injustice she suffered, but in the reflection of our own failings, a mirror held up to the darkness within us all. The elder's reflection culminated in a call to remember and learn from the past, to recognize the cost of surrendering to fear without question. Let the story of the herbalist, her wisdom, her bravery, and her unjust end, be a guide for us all. In her, we see the dangers of allowing fear to dictate our actions, the importance of seeking understanding and truth, and the profound impact one individual can have on the world around them. Her legacy, though born of tragedy, carries with it the hope that future generations may walk a path illuminated by the light of knowledge and understanding, rather than the shadows of fear and suspicion. In this reflection, the elder offered not just a recounting of past events, but a beacon for the future, a solemn reminder of the importance of compassion, the pursuit of truth, and the enduring human capacity for growth and change. Through the tragic tale of the herbalist, the village learned a harsh but invaluable lesson. That the true path to overcoming darkness lies not in the suppression of what we fear, but in the embrace of understanding, the courage to face the unknown, and the wisdom to recognize the value of every soul in the fabric of our shared humanity.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the video. We highly recommend you watch the next video here. Oops. I'm waiting for you to click. Yes, you've clicked. Happy watching.